Hey everybody, this is Don, and it is time for episode 20 of Practical Reality. And I know some people might be tempted to say, wow, it's our 20th episode, I can't believe it. Well, I can believe it. It's only 20 episodes, and I have 10 whole subscribers, which is great, double digits. But I hope to have like 1,000 by the time I get to 200. We'll see what happens. We'll see what fate brings me. I'm sitting here in Donaldson Park again, of course, on the banks of the Raritan River. It's about 60 degrees, and of course there is a breeze blowing. As usual, anytime you're in this park, because of its proximity to the water, there's almost always a breeze. So it's about 60 degrees, and there's actually some leaves coming out on the trees. It's the beginning of April, so it's time for spring, and spring is a time of renewal, which always makes me feel good. So today's topic is going to be, what do drugs do to your soul? And I think this is a very important topic to discuss. And it's funny, I was thinking about doing this kind of video on this subject since I started the channel, but I wasn't exactly sure when to include it. And someone made a remark to me the other day that just sort of triggered me to say, okay, now's the time to do it. So here I am, we're going to talk about what drugs do to your soul. And of course, people might be out there saying, well, how the hell do you know what drugs do to your soul? So I'm going to relate to you some of my own personal experiences with drugs. The first time I ever smoked marijuana, you're going to laugh your ass off, but the first time I ever smoked it, I got busted. I was in the woods. I was about 15, I think, and I was in the woods behind my old grammar school. And they were showing, one of the concerts that they used to have with cover bands in grammar schools in the auditorium. And it was outside with a guy that I knew from school, high school, and he had this bong. And he's like, oh, you want to try some weed? I'm like, okay, you know what I mean? And I went back there into the woods, and I didn't even know how to use the bong. And I think I took maybe 2 or 3 hits, and all of a sudden this cop scared the living crap out of us and basically took the bong out of our hands and smashed it on the rocks and said, get the hell out of here. That's basically all that happened. Nothing else happened. Could have been a lot worse. It's far, far different than the attitude that cops have today. I'll give you another example of that. When I was 17, I went to my first concert, Bob Dylan at Madison Square Garden. And I bought backstage seats, which I didn't realize even existed at the time. And we were driving into Manhattan, and I made a wrong turn coming out of the Lincoln Tunnel, and I headed south instead of north. And we ended up in the meatpacking district, where the cobblestone streets are. And somehow I got a flat tire. And we had a bottle of Southern Comfort, like a pint of Southern Comfort, and I don't know, some amount of weed. And we were smoking bowls and this kind of thing and driving along in New York City, and we get this flat tire. We have to pull over and change the tire. And I had one of those, not a scissor jack where you crank it. It was a jack you had to turn, which went up much, much more slowly and was difficult to do, especially in my inebriated and stoned state. John was trying to help me too, but with the two of us, we're kind of wasted and it was difficult to do. So what happens, along comes a police tow truck, a New York City police tow truck, 2 officers in it, and they come along and they see our predicament, and they look in the car and they start to crack up. And they're like, you guys are absolutely crazy. And I think they use some other more selective words that I don't want to say in this video, but what they ended up doing, actually, was using their tow truck to help me pick the car off the ground and change the tire in 5 minutes, and told us to get the hell out of there again. And that's basically the attitude that cops had back then. Drugs were considered to be relatively harmless, and they didn't really care too much about busting people for it, this kind of thing. Like I said, it's a far, far different situation than you have today. And the funny part about what happened in the parking lot there is the jack was, like I said, one of the ones you have to crank by turning, and my knuckles were scraping on the cobblestone street. So I actually were bleeding from my knuckles, and I was wiping it on my jeans. So I ended up going to my first Bob Dylan concert with streaks of blood all over my jeans. I must have looked like I'd gotten out of a street fight at the time. So anyway, there's a summation of my personal experience with drugs. And there are far, far many. I've done drugs like, I've done acid, I did cocaine a few times. Never really liked cocaine. I did crystal meth once, that's all. Didn't like that at all. My primary drug of choice was marijuana and its derivatives like hash and that kind of stuff. So yes, I've had an extensive experience with drugs, and it's important for me to tell you why I don't do them anymore and why I think you should avoid them if you can. Now, first of all, I want you to understand what the social aspect of drugs is. Drugs are often things, at least in my experience, things that were done with groups of people, with friends, things you did at parties. That's usually the way it was. Okay, and yet at the time, I remember telling people I'm an experimentalist. I tried the drugs because I wanted to experiment. And that was, of course, when I was in my teens and 20s, before I was the least bit conscious of my spirituality and the flow of my energy, this kind of thing. So yeah, I've sat around campfires and I've sat around dorm rooms getting high. And I remember one time I actually had to drive home tripping on acid in my mom's car from a party at my friend's house, which was quite an experience. So yeah, there's a social aspect of it, and many people consider that to be relatively harmless. And it might be from a social standpoint, but what is it from a bodily and a mental and a spiritual standpoint? That's an entirely different question. So if you end up getting dependent or addicted to one of these drugs, what happens over time is the circumstances change. You don't necessarily care about whether you're with somebody or not. The social aspect sort of disappears. At least that's what happened for me. I smoked marijuana for many years, and I'm, knock on wood, I'm lucky to have not suffered that much ill effect from it. But I'm not going to deny that there were ill effects. Okay, very serious. It became something, and this is still the same to this day, where if I have marijuana in my possession, I have to smoke it. I can't just like want to do it on the weekends, do it on Saturday and Sunday and put it away and don't do it again until Friday night, that kind of thing. I can't do that. If I have it, I have to smoke some every few hours, maybe 4 or 5 hours, that kind of thing. If I smoke some in the at lunch, this kind of thing. I smoke some by 3 or 4 o'clock. And I smoke some again at 8 o'clock, that kind of thing. That's the way it works for me. I don't have enough control over it to be able to master when I smoke or not. So that is, I don't know whether you want to call that an addiction or not. Maybe some people would, by definition. But that is lack of mastery over my desire. And that is a form of addiction, I guess. I have to admit that. So that's why I avoid it entirely. So that's what happens for so many people. And you hear the stories about addicts who start out on prescription drugs and become incredibly dependent on those. And I've seen hundreds of stories on social media about poor kids in their 20s, teens and 20s, who become so addicted to these things. And then, when the doctor stops giving them those prescription drugs, they move to other drugs that are even more dangerous and end up dying from overdoses, which is a real shame and a completely unnecessary tragedy. And it breaks the hearts of the people around them, which is incredibly sad. So if you find yourself in the situation where, you used to be a social butterfly and used to smoke, weed or do lines or whatever with your friends, or what do they call that stuff? I forget the name of it, ecstasy. If you did that stuff with your friends and you find yourself doing it alone, then you have a problem. And if you can't master that and stay away from it when you're alone, not with other people, then you definitely have a problem. If you prefer to do it by yourself. And even alcohol is the same way. Doctors have told me many times that when you sit home and drink by yourself, and if you do that every day, then that's a problem. And of course, moderation in alcohol is incredibly important. There are actually, I think there's a level of alcohol that they actually find acceptable on a daily basis that doesn't do you much harm. But when it becomes a problem, I have known several alcoholics in my life who completely ruin their lives as a result of alcohol. It's a very, very dangerous thing. And that becomes a situation, and I know people who have done this, who are sitting in their room and they hide it in their drawer because they don't want anybody else to know that they're drinking. And they sit in their room and they drink and drink and drink until they get completely inebriated and can't function anymore. And their lives become ruinous. Now, what happens to a person who suffers that kind of isolation? This is the important point that I want to make, okay? You separate yourself from your friends, you separate yourself from your life, but you also separate yourself from your soul. Now, I've also heard what I would consider to be a myth about people who become more creative as a result of their use of drugs. To me, that's garbage. Maybe, there might be some people who are the exception, but I think in general the rule is that is garbage. You don't become more creative. You may have certain thoughts that you might not have when you're straight, but to say you're more creative, I think, is a ridiculous lie. You are creative when you put yourself in a creative state of mind. And how do you enter a creative state of mind when you're straight? You have to slow yourself down. And this is where the spirituality aspect of it comes in. Slow yourself down. Do that breathing exercise that I recommended in one of my other videos. Get yourself into a state where you can be quiet and quiet that constant stream of thoughts, and then be able to put yourself in the mindset of creativity. That is how creativity happens to a person who is sober. They sit, they let their mind slow, and then they turn their attention to the subject upon which they want to be creative. To me, that's how true creativity happens. And you can't do that when your mind is altered. And I also read something else earlier today while studying, taking notes to make this video. The energy centers of the body are all negatively affected by the use of drugs. There are 7, I believe it is, chakras in the body that are energy centers, and every single one of them is negatively affected by the use of drugs. So you take yourself out of the flow. If you are aiming for a conscious life, to live a spiritual existence based upon meditation and self-directed behavior, you cannot possibly justify the use of drugs to try to achieve that aim or that objective. You are not going to be able to. You have to be able to say, okay, here I am now. I don't need drugs. I'm going to be creative on my own. I'm going to sit here and I'm going to be able to say, I can do a creative activity without being high and give it a try. And I think you would find the rewards to be far, far greater than what happens when you are under the influence of a drug. And that becomes a habit that is healthy. And I talked about good habits in my last video, and I think this ties right into that. You want to be a creative person. Okay, fine. And for a person who, I'm talking about my creativity is writing poetry. So when I do that, it usually comes as a rush to me. And I have been on drugs before and trying to high on marijuana, trying to meditate. It doesn't work. You think it does, but it doesn't. You just simply don't feel connected. The state of mind in which you wish to achieve is just not possible when you're high. So I would encourage everyone to understand that the aspect that you want to achieve, the state of mind you want to achieve, is just not possible when you're high. The drugs are going to take you in a direction that you don't want to go. Whether you think that's creative or not is another story. But as far as being conscious is concerned, you cannot remain in a state of mind that is affected by drugs, any drug, and become conscious. Be connected to the flow of the universe. That flow of the universe is a benign force and is a pure force. And only with a mind that is clear can you connect to that force and become a part of it and use it then to direct your internal environment. Instead, another point I've been making, for you to be in control of your internal environment instead of letting the external environment control you. And of course, we all know that that's one of the main reasons why people do drugs, because of the pressures of life, because of the way that the external environment exerts pressure and stress on you. So people turn to drugs to escape. So obviously then, if you are able to achieve a state of calm, a state of quieting of the mind without using drugs and connect to the flow of the universe, you are in a far, far better situation than you are if you use drugs to escape temporarily. Because, of course, what happens when the effect of the drug wears off? You are still faced with the same problems and in the same situation. And the only solution to a person who is addicted to a drug is to go find more of the drug and escape the situation again, which obviously helps nothing. And of course, the effects of drugs over the long term are all deleterious. There is no good effect of drugs over the long period of time. And I mean, obviously, you know, what happens to a person when they're high? They get clumsy, they forget things, they do stupid stuff, they make irrational decisions. All of that stuff is a temporary effect. But if it becomes a long-standing habit, then those kind of effects can be long-term. And you don't want that kind of thing to happen to you. Your body is a temple. Your body is the only body that you will ever have. And the best way to take care of it is to avoid doing drugs and to be the kind of person who can be clear-minded in a state of consciousness and creativity, if you wish, by slowing your mind down and having those kind of clear thoughts without doing drugs. And I think everybody can take solace in the fact that this is possible. And this is might be the most important point I'm making here. To believe that you can't slow down, that's a limiting belief. You can slow that constant stream of thoughts down and get yourself into a state of calmness where you can start thinking about the things you want to achieve, whether that be a creative end or not, any professional goal that you set for yourself, any sort of creative goal, any sort of athletic goal, any sort of relationship goal, all of that. You are far better off to be in a calm state of mind and a contemplative state of mind to connect to the flow of the universe without the need for using drugs to escape the situation. So I think that is probably the most important point I'm making in this whole video, and I hope everybody listens to that and takes it to heart. So I think then the last point I want to make is the importance of recognition, okay? As they say in AA, the first step is admitting you have the problem. So how can you recognize it within yourself, okay? If you do isolate, if you find yourself in a state of despair, of course, the withdrawal from the high always leaves you in a state feeling like, your despair, you realize the problems are still with you, the weight of the world comes back on your shoulders. How do you escape from that, okay? In recognizing you have the problem is the first step. Doing something about it is a second step. Seeking counseling, seeking medical help, another step you can take. And of course, you can always take that step to try and quiet your mind and become the controller of your internal environment and find the peace within your soul that can relieve the need for drugs. So I thank everybody for listening to this video. I hope everybody understands the point I'm trying to make. And I hope everybody has a peaceful, prosperous, and healthy day. Thank you very much. Like, comment, or subscribe if you wish. Don signing off for episode 20 of Practical Reality.